Well, good afternoon, ladies. It's lovely to see you. Happy half term, and we're back on track with the next set of narrated PowerPoints, this time for Course Companion 14, which is the international economy that we're starting to look at. And this is going to cover globalisation and terms of trade, and move on to look at various other areas which are to do with international competitiveness, etc. So in the first instance, we're going to look at globalisation. So I've actually put the Course Companion 14 onto Teams under Class Materials under CC14, and also this first PowerPoint I've also included there. So if you want to go through it without the narration, then clearly you can do that too. Okay, so without further ado, let's get cracking. So globalisation then. Something we talk about a lot. What is it? What exactly is globalization? Let's take a look at that together. Okay, the first thing we're going to do though is consider the specification and the key areas that you're going to need to understand. So number one is the causes of globalization. Two is the main are the main characteristics of globalization, and then the consequences of globalization for less developed and more developed countries, and also the roles of multinational companies or corporations, also known as sometimes as MNCs or TNCs, transnational companies. Basically, multinational and transnational are essentially the same, and the roles that they have performed and the elements that they've got involved with as far as globalization is concerned. So let's take a look at some of the key terms that we might need to be aware of. First and foremost then, globalization, if we're taking it from an economic rather than a geographic perspective, it's the ever-increasing integration of world's local, regional and national economies into a single international market. So that's the definition, if you like. Now, one of the things you also need to bear in mind is that much as globalization is considered to be a very good thing by lots of people, there are views that suggest that globalization is not a great thing. Okay, so deglobalization is almost eschewing the principles of globalization and actually thinking about sort of minimizing or reducing free trade and international trade. And in this case, that can involve countries adopting protectionist policies in order to protect domestic employment. And that could lead to a decline in specialisation of world trade, lower FDI, and also lower levels of short-run money flows between countries. So effectively, it's almost saying, well, globalisation isn't a good thing, and we're going to do things to try to avoid some of the pitfalls of globalisation by going for the principle of deglobalisation. Okay, so again, just to take a look at the definition, we just talked about that, and I've shown you that, but there's quite a nice quote here from Peter J. And basically his view was that globalization is the ability to produce any good or service anywhere in the world using raw materials, components, capital and technology from anywhere, selling the resulting output anywhere, and place the profits anywhere. So clearly that's a slightly more succinct view, if you like, in terms of how you might actually then implement globalization if you believe that the principle of it as a good thing. Some of the characteristics of globalization then are clearly these are some of the things that you're going to need to have to recognize, and what it is, what does it bring, what are the advantages and disadvantages of it. But let's just take a look at some of those things together then. If we look at one of the key things, it's one of the key characteristics of globalization is an increased level of trade in goods and services. Now, obviously, the principle of international trade is that we specialize in areas that we're good at, and as a result of that, we're able to trade internationally with other parts of the world. So that's clearly one fundamental characteristic of globalization. The other thing, another very important principle, is that we have an expansion of foreign direct investment, FDI, as it's known, by transnational companies and multinational companies. Like I said, transnational, multinational companies, basically one of the same. And there are some questions that have been sort of posed for you here. What is a multinational company? What is direct FDI? and why do multinational companies wish to invest in other countries? Well, to some degree, you'll find that out as we go along, but also I want to draw your attention to page 3 in your booklet, which actually lists some key terms, some of them that we talked about, but others that you'll need to get familiar with too. So take a look at that on page 3 in your booklet. And also, I've gone straight into giving you some example essay questions. I messed around. You've got three 25 markers, 1 5 marker and 1 15 marker, just to give you an idea of the sorts of flavour of question that you might get posed when talking about globalisation. And that is at the bottom of page 3. Okay, so there are three 25 mark question, typical 25 mark questions, 1 5 marker, and also a 15 marker, which I think in that instance is applicable to a data response item that you would get in an exam paper. But it gives you a flavour for the sort of approach that you might need to adopt, and gives you a chance to look at command words and maybe look at planning how you might go about answering some of those exam-based questions. So third issue, so we've got the first two, increasing trade in goods, expansion of FDI. Third one is the development of global brands that serve markets in higher and lower income countries. Now, clearly, as brands have become global phenomena, that has become more and more important, and you can probably name a number of global brands very quickly, because they are almost ubiquitous in terms of their spread across the world. Typical examples, so Exxon is a massive oil company that some of you will be familiar with, while Starbucks is clearly a rather large international coffee chain, and actually they have got branches all over the world. We've got Sony, and then we've got Trotter's independent traders, who clearly want to become a global player, but aren't quite in New York, Paris, but certainly they're in Peckham. We'll draw a veil over that particular joke, such as it was. Anyway, so some of the principles of globalization, characteristics of globalization that we would be looking for. So if you get a question on globalization, then it may not say we want you to talk specifically about globalization. It might actually just talk about a large number of multinational companies, or talk about multinational companies as a principle of foreign direct investment. And those two things are pointers towards multinational or transnational companies, and also globalization, of course. And one of the things to bear in mind is that you're not necessarily going to get asked a straightforward question. You might need to sort of read between the lines a bit. Okay, the fourth area then, the fourth characteristic of globalization, global supply chains. So that effectively means that there could be some outsourcing or some offshoring of production and support services as production supply chains have become much more international. And as we know, the majority of multinational companies, not all, but the majority of multinational companies will move production facilities to the place that they can get the goods produced at the cheapest level. And generally speaking, that's down to the labour cost. So clearly, that's also something to bear in mind. So we've got this globalization of the supply chain as well. That is another reason for globalization becoming so important. Again, referring back to some of these definitions that you might need to look at, there are on page 3. Outsourcing and offshoring are actually well defined in page 3 in your booklets. But basically, outsourcing and offshoring sometimes get a bit confused. They are similar, but they're not the same. Okay, so outsourcing is contracting out a business process to another party, so someone else does the work for you, for your company. Okay, so that's outsourcing. Whereas offshoring means that the company produces a good or service in another country, so effectively produces their goods and services themselves, but in another country. So a quick sip of tea. Don't mind, sorry, I do apologise. Let's then take a look at a table then to sort of try and make sure that you understand the difference between the two, offshoring and outsourcing. The table there for you to have a go at filling in. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to have a go at that. So do you think these operational decisions are examples of offshoring or outsourcing? So you might need to just revisit the definitions again, make sure you understand what the definitions mean, and in this case, then decide whether you think a UK business setting up its own call centre in Bangalore to serve UK customers is an example of offshoring or outsourcing. Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to do that. You want to stop the presentation for a minute and have a go at completing that table, and then we'll come back and talk about the options that you could have chosen. Okay, so welcome back, and basically let's take a look at the response then. Okay, so in the first instance, its own call centre in Bangalore suggests that we are actually offshoring. Okay, so in that situation, we're not actually getting somebody else to do it for us. We're setting up our own call centre, but we're using Indian staff in this case, so we and hiring Indian staff to do that. The toy manufacturer contracts with overseas suppliers to produce certain components which it imports into the UK would be an example of outsourcing. Okay? And the next one, the UK-based firm hands over its payroll and IT transactions to a specialist supplier in the UK. That again would be an example of outsourcing. So you're getting somebody else to do that for you on your behalf. Okay. Then finally, a UK supermarket retailer opens its first stores in the US, managed by a team based in the USA. That would be an example of offshoring, where effectively you are setting up in another country, but you are producing, or in this case, retailing in that other country yourself. You're not doing it through an agent of some description. Okay, so that's just a relatively simple example, a few relatively simple examples, but it's a sort of question that does come up quite often, simply because people get a little bit confused about offshoring and outsourcing. It's probably only going to be a 5 mark or so, but being able to define the difference between the two is clearly quite an important thing to be able to do. Okay, so let's have a look at then this issue around transnational, multinational companies. I think in most of this presentation we talked about TNCs, transnational companies, but TNCs and MNCs, transnational and multinational companies, are exactly the same. Okay, so it's just the terminology that sometimes varies. Okay, so in terms of the reasons for why have transnational companies grown to be such an important area, well, we'll take a look at a few, and some of them you will be familiar with in terms of some of the reasons for the existence of TNCs. First and fairly obvious one is economies of scale. So fundamentally, if we think about economies of scale and try and define it, that's where we're talking about trying to get our long-run unit costs or average cost of production to keep falling, getting it to the point where we're at the lowest cost of average cost of production, long-run average cost. And obviously, in order to do that, we're going to scale up our production to get the benefits of various different forms of economies of scale. So that's clearly a fairly important reason behind why transnational companies have become so important. Another area is knowledge and innovation. So thinking about transnational, multinational companies, they are generally fairly big organisations. They've been successful in their home markets and then have chosen to expand into other areas too. And as a result of that, they're going to have a large amount of resource. They're going to have powerful innovation and research and development arms, and they're going to be able to apply that knowledge and innovation in a way that actually allows them to create a difference and become more internationally competitive. Example industries include oil extraction, engineering, microchips, even supermarkets with sophisticated logistics systems. Okay, so clearly there is the knowledge and innovation that they've got, and the way in which they apply that innovation is clearly another reason why they've grown to such a large degree. Branding and marketing, clearly also very important. Successful brands have been sold across the world: Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Apple, Google, you name it. There are a whole raft of them, and they're all household names. And the reason that they're so powerful is because their brands are so strong. And businesses are very, very careful to protect their brands and make sure they're not being abused or misused in any shape or form, because they appreciate just how important they are as a means of differentiating what might be quite similar products from their competition. So protecting brands with copyrights and trademarks and patents, and the use of heavy advertising and promotion is what why transnational companies have become so successful. You could also argue that their power, their market and political power, is something that they choose to exploit. Okay, so a global business in some cases might have greater sales and profits than the gross national product or gross domestic product of the countries that they're choosing to set up in. So they have massive power. Okay. It might be that they've got very strong market share, and they're a very powerful market leader. And obviously, in that situation, they might choose to then use that power in a slightly wrong fashion, and they might be putting anti-competitive practices in place. But clearly, they have the financial resources to get exactly what they want. And if you think about a relatively small country that's got a large labour force, well, that might mean that a large transnational company might come in and say, well, we're willing to set up in your country, but they're going to want more than their pound of flesh in terms of incentives for why they might want to set up in different countries. The main reason why transnational companies will set up, the two main reasons really, why they set up in different parts of the world. One is to benefit from lower labour costs. That's probably the fundamental reason. So again, reducing average cost of production, long run average cost of production. But also they might well be wanting to target a particular area and maybe getting closer to understand the global market that they're working within. They might choose to set up close to where they're planning to target in the future. So next thing that we want to look at then, so a number of reasons why transnational companies are so important and why they've become a real powerful proponent really of globalization, and one of the reasons behind it. But also this principle of FDI becomes very important, okay? Because in this instance, what we're saying is that transnational companies have chosen to spend an awful lot of money directly into different parts of the global economy. So foreign direct investment, okay, long-term investment in transnational companies, or by transnational companies in countries overseas. So normally it happens in two different ways. One, the transnational company either builds new plants or expands their existing facilities in foreign countries as one way, and the other is that the TNC might merge with or acquire or buy existing firms in foreign countries. Okay, now clearly in some cases that is the lifeblood for some countries, because if we're getting this direct investment into our economy as a relatively small or less well developed country, then that is going to be a big plus in terms of employment and also potential wealth for the employees, or improving their level of income and disposable income and consumption as a result. So let's just take a look at how this might be demonstrated then as an example. Okay, there's quite a nice example, and it's included on page 6 in your booklet about the iPad. And an example of the global supply chain that we've talked about. So we can see here, it's quite a nice graphic, this, and actually I want you to take a little look at it and have a go at answering the questions that are being posed on the slide here. They're also, I think, in your booklet. So 3 questions, but also just take a look at that overall retail price of an iPad. Now this is going back some while, because I think $499 is probably quite cheap for an iPad these days. However, so back in 2010, so clearly it's moved on a bit and probably doubled in price, hasn't it? So it gives you an idea of just how, well, number one, where the thing was designed, number 2, where it was produced, and number 3, how the split of that $499 is broken down. Okay, so first things first, then 5 countries which are a part of the supply chain. Then have a go at calculating Apple's profit as a percentage of the sales price, and then also look at calculating the labour cost as a percentage of the sales price. Okay. Now, bearing in mind that Apple are a very strong global producer of goods and services of this nature, and probably one of the well, definitely the market leader in this area. They, to some degree, are going to be using their market power and dictating the price. So they are going to be a price maker rather than a price taker. And in this instance, the way in which they might split the price, the retail price, might prove to be quite interesting, as you'll see. Okay, so again, I'm going to give you a few minutes just to have a go at answering those questions. A couple of simple calculations to look at, and also the 5 countries that are part of the supply chain. Okay, so let's take a look at this now. Obviously, there are a number of examples here that have been included. We've got China, we've got the European Union, we've got Taiwan, Japan, other United States, 12, so and subcontractors in South Korea are 34. So significant number of different organisations dotted across the world that are actually providing parts to the overall iPad. Let's take a look then at this breakdown of profit for argument's sake then. Okay, so we can see Apple's profit on the $499 iPad in this case was $150. If we divide that by the original sales price, we can see we're making a 30% profit, clear profit for Apple on each iPad sold, which is clearly very healthy, as you can see. If we then take a look at what the labour cost is in comparison, and you can see in this case we've got labour cost of 33, and if we divide that by 499, which is the $499, you can see that the labour cost just 6.6% in this instance. Okay, so and we get that figure of 33 by adding unidentified as 25 and 8 as China. So you can see that that the labour cost, you would think for something like this would be fairly high, but clearly Apple being Apple and large organisations being large organisations, they're using the cheapest, most efficient form of labour in order to reduce their overall cost of production and make more profit as a result. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the next thing then. Okay, now there is quite a nice clip on YouTube that I'd like you to take a look at. The link is there on page 7 in your booklets, but it's also a live link that you can go and take a look at here. It's only about 4 minutes long, but it gives you a nice principle of some of the reasons and causes of globalisation. I think that's right. I think it's about 3.5 minutes long. But there are some questions I want you to have a go at answering, which actually are listed there. Okay, so have a go at that. Have a look at the YouTube clip. I've got a feeling I might have that wrong. I think it is slightly longer than 3.5 minutes. But anyway, have a watch of it and then have a go at answering those questions. And then what we'll do is come back and have a go at answering those questions together. Okay. Okie dokie. So, causes of globalisation then. First things first. How much has the cost of a telephone call from New York to London fallen since 1930? A significant fall, as you'll see, down 99% since 1930. So, the cost of technology and improvements in technology and communications, that is clearly going to make it much, much easier and much, much cheaper to be able to communicate across the pond between New York and London, as an example. So in not that long a period of time, 99% fall, and in fact, it's probably significant, fallen even further. Not that it's got a long way to fall. If it's fallen 99% since 1930, but when we think about virtual private networks and the use of mobile telephony, etc. That's clearly once you've got the tools in place, that then it's almost a no-cost telephone call, isn't it? How much has transportation costs dropped since 1930? Then down 65%. So you can see that the cost of transportation, combine that with the communications improvements and the speed at which we can communicate these days, then that is obviously significant, and a significant reason why international trade has mushroomed in the way that it has. Well, if we think about why that is, and just sort of break that down a wee bit, and this is actually included in the video. Well, fuel costs are down in real terms. Economies of scale in the shipping industry have obviously improved, and containerization, which is a massive thing, has also made it much easier and much more time efficient to be able to transport goods all the way around the world, particularly in containers and on ships, etc. And also air freight costs have fallen significantly. So huge reasons, because the costs have fallen to such a large degree, to encourage globalization. Let's take a look at question number 4, and these are actually in your booklet as well on page 7. Freight charges for a ton of coffee delivered from Asia to Europe only account for 1% of its price. Now that's or when the video is taken, which was basically 2011. So clearly a relatively small amount. Now, if you'd have rewound that back to the 1930s, it would have been a significantly higher percentage that would have accounted for. Talking about the next question then, what barriers have many countries worked towards reducing since the 1980s, and it's what is the process known as? Well, removal of import barriers, either tariffs or quotas, and also the role of the World Trade Organization to try and encourage more free trade. So as the barriers to trade have fallen and reduced, that clearly has been another reason why globalization has become such an important phenomenon. Next question, what does the clip say about FDI spending in 1970 and today? Well, we can see that FDI, foreign direct investment, quite an important principle, and you can see how massively important it is now in terms of the amount of money that's spent. 13 billion, which was a significant amount back in 1970, up to 1,800 billion today. So humongous growth in the last 50 years or so. And if we take a look at the growth in the number of multinational companies or transnational companies from the 90s to today, well, there were around about 7,000 in 1990. Today, 65,000 multinational companies across the world, which clearly is a significant boost to globalization as more and more organizations look to the advantages that that's going to bring. Okay, so the next thing I want you to take a look at is, again, this principle of containerization is something we've talked about. Really important, quite a nice video. It's only about 5-6 minutes long, I think, but it just explains some of the principles behind containerization and where the original invention came from, and why it's become almost all pervading in terms, and one of the main reasons why shipping goods around the world has become so cost effective and so quick. But I'll leave you to take a look at that. That link should work if you're viewing it from the main slideshow format, but it's also included. I don't think that one is included in your booklet. Actually, no, it's not. So you'll have to view it via the PowerPoint. Okay, but it's a really good example of and quite a nicely explained view on containerization and how important it is. Okay, so let's take a look at we've sort of almost touched on this principle of what's been happening to globalization over the last 50 years and what have been the main factors. Well, we're just going to run through a few of those together, and hopefully it will make some sense. First one is trade liberalization. So we talked about that in the previous slide, but where we're talking about removing trade barriers like tariffs or quotas, that has been significantly reducing in recent decades, especially for manufactured goods. A number of reasons for that. One being that we've got former communist countries like China and Russia who have joined the global trading system, and they have moved from being planned economies, very much command economies where the government pretty much controls everything that's going on, to much more market-based economies. Not to say that they don't still have some involvement, but that has meant that two things. One, they've opened up international trade and also foreign direct investment. If we think about China at the moment, they are still considered to be the manufacturing centre of the world simply because they have humongous amounts of resources dedicated to producing goods, manufactured goods in particular, at a cheaper price than most people can produce them at. Other things, global trade agreements that have been signed at the World Trade Organization level. So clearly, that's all about trying to encourage more trade, more international trade, and that has also been a huge contributor to globalization over the last 50 years or so. Other things we talked about: reduced cost of communications. Clearly, transmitting and communicating information it's been ridiculous, the difference in the costs involved, sometimes known as the death of distance. And when you think about how easy it is to communicate with people across the world, with emails and FaceTime and video conferencing and Lord knows what else, it's an incredibly powerful contributor towards globalization. Examples that we could look at. The decreased cost of transport. Again, containerization. The cost of ocean shipping has come down significantly. Okay, mainly due to containerization and the use of larger container ships. But in each instance, all of these things are actually helping to make a big difference. And there are some questions that are posed here. Why has this reduced the cost of transporting goods? And clearly, the reduction in cost of transporting goods has made it a much more attractive principle to apply. Okay, a minute. And in each instance, you can see that would be a reason why foreign direct investment would increase, because if you can gain benefits from reduced costs of communications, more choice, quicker speed to market, those are clearly going to be reasons why, in some cases, FDI is also going to be encouraged, as there seems to be more opportunities to go and influence new markets and also gain higher levels of profit due to economies of scale. The other thing that is definitely contributing to globalization is the rising skill levels in developing countries. So multinational companies are choosing to set up in developing countries where, whilst the labour cost may be relatively low, the skill set is actually relatively high. And obviously, as a result of that, some very big organisations have outsourced some of their work to other parts of the world, and that's because the level of skill and also the relatively low cost of labour is obviously a very powerful incentive for large transnational and multinational companies to take advantage of. Okay, so thinking about why a company like BT might choose to outsource call centres to jobs in India, well, two reasons really. Well, the main reason being relatively low labour costs and also high levels of technological capability to set up these call centres. So lots and lots of issues around the reasons for globalisation being such a powerful force for international trade over the last 50 years. Okay, well, let's take a look at some of the impacts of globalisation and the global companies on countries, individual countries, governments, producers, consumers, workers, and the environment. And if you were going to do an essay on globalisation, that would be a good way of trying to put a plan together. Okay, think particularly if it's an impacts-based question, considering all those different economic agents and individuals and things that may be affected by globalisation would be a good way to sort of plan that process, if you like. So let's take a look, and I'm going to stop after I've done this, after I've finished this little bit here, because this next bit requires you to watch around about a 50-minute documentary about the issue around globalization. It's called The Good and the Ugly Effects of Globalization, and it's based on a series called On the Brink, A World on the Brink, and it's a bit of a lot. It's quite a long watch, but actually, in terms of a really good summary of some of the good reasons why globalization has happened, and some of the issues around some of the less good items and less good things about globalization, that gives a very good summary of it. And there are 7 questions on page 9 that I'd like to have a go at answering. Now, based on a bit of research that you might do for yourself, but also based on watching this Good and Ugly Effects of Globalization. The link is included there, and also in your booklet, and that should allow you to really get an insight into some of the whys and wherefores, the impacts of globalization, and how important it's become as a source of growth in international trade. Okay, so I'll leave you to watch that and have a go at answering those questions, and we'll come back next time and take a look at some of the other issues around globalization. This particular example is specifically about China and how they have influenced the changes that have gone on in world trade. And the next one we'll start with next time round is an example of how the UK has been affected by those changes too. Okay.